I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc., I welcome you to our program tonight. A special welcome to our very special guest tonight, Nick Kristof, and to the wonderful Patt Morrison. Thanks to our leadership team, former Congressman Mel Levine. If he was our congressman now, he wouldn't be with us tonight. Former LA County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky, David Lair, Caroline Kelly, Rabbi Ken Chazen, and myself. Remember, we have no control over Eventbrite's registration process, but you know that I can always help you register, and I will always get you the Zoom link. We are very sorry about the delays we encountered this past week in posting last week's program with Michigan Governor Whitmer. It is now up, and we're hoping tonight's program will be up about 3 hours after its conclusion. So for those of you who were emailing that you were disappointed not to see it, you now have your opportunity. Next week, we will welcome the brilliant former acting Solicitor General of the United States, Neil Katyal, who has argued a record-breaking 50 cases in the past decade before the U.S. Supreme Court. You might see him frequently on MSNBC, where he consults for legal analysis on almost every major legal issue of our time. Those laws which he hasn't litigated, he actually drafted, so he's quite the legal force in our country. Next week, he will shed light on law and democracy and where we are headed. He will be in conversation with the always terrific Warren Olney. The following week, we are very excited to bring back the outstanding Max Boot, who just returned from the Ukraine. He will bring us his firsthand impressions of Ukraine and the war, and we'll talk foreign and domestic politics. The title of his talk, which will be moderated also by Warren Olney, is Ukraine, Russia, the US, and the GOP. So we hope you'll join us for those and for the ones following that. Now for a couple more announcements, my friend and terrific colleague, David Lair. David?
Thank you, Janice. Welcome, everyone. We're honored to have one of America's leading newspaper columnists with us tonight, Nick Kristof, a man who has literally altered the course of opinion columns by virtue of what he has chosen to write about, human rights and their abuse, among other critical topics. We're blessed also with 2 Pulitzer Prize winners, both our guest and our moderator. After the terrific programs that Janet just mentioned, on June 21st, we'll bring back Peter Baker, a colleague of Nick's at the New York Times. Peter's the Times' chief White House correspondent. He's expert in both domestic and foreign issues, not only because he served in the cover of the White House, but also because at an earlier point in his career, he and his wife were the co-chief correspondents in Moscow of the Washington Post. He'll be in dialogue with Larry Mantle. The following week, we'll have a visit with Ron Brownstein, the Atlantic magazine and CNN's polling maven. In the world of politics, if you want a sense of what's going on just below the surface and beyond the headlines, Ron is the person to talk to. Tonight's host, Patt Morrison, will be his interlocutor. It's now my pleasure to introduce Patt, a longtime friend, an award-winning columnist for the LA Times, and the winner of numerous Emmys and Golden Mikes for her work on public television and radio. The always astute and analytical Patt Morrison. Pat?
David, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody who's watching and everybody who supports this program at such a vital time in the country's history and the world's history. And we're joined by someone who has a little bit of something to say and knows a great deal more about both of those topics. He's the op-ed columnist for the New York Times, as you heard, a double Pulitzer Prize winner, one of them with his wife, Sheryl Wu Dunn, who is also with him the co-author of their best-selling books. In 2009, Bill Clinton said this of our guest: "There's no one in journalism anywhere in the United States, at least, who's done anything like the work he has done to figure out how poor people are actually living around the world and what their potential is. So every American citizen who cares about this should be profoundly grateful that someone in our press establishment cares enough about this to haul himself around the world to figure out what's going on." And now he's hauled himself right here, I think back in his own study, to join us. Nick, thank you so much.
Great to be with you. I'm hauling myself under the screen on the family farm here in Yamhill, Oregon. And if you hear a farm dog barking, that's the dog is trying to contribute to the discussion.
Well, and if you hear an urban dog barking, that's my dog talking to your dog. So I think we've established communication lines there. So I want to start with one particular area of expertise of yours, which is China. We see a great deal in the headlines. Of course, the superpower relationship with the United States is an ongoing source of some tension. And we just had what is called unprofessional intercept contact between US military jets and Chinese military jets in violation, it seems, of a pact over what happens in midair. Cowboy maneuvers was the phrase I read by Chinese military aircraft risk a midair crash that would create a crisis in US-China relations. China always seems to be pushing the envelope in virtually every sphere of endeavor and influence.
Yeah, I should first of all say that, look, a China expert is an oxymoron. And, you know, it's hard to know exactly where things will go. But I do think that it's wise to be concerned about the risk of accident more than an actual invasion of Taiwan, as some people I know seem to talk about. I think a all-out invasion of Taiwan is unlikely in the next 5 years or so. I do think that there is a risk of the kind of incident that just happened where, you know, a Chinese jet, maybe a Chinese boat is in close quarters with an American plane or boat, and there's a collision. This happened in 2001 off the island of Hainan, and it created a crisis in bilateral relations. At that time, the president of China, Jiang Zemin, worked very hard to defuse it. Right now, President Xi Jinping would not work to diffuse it. He would work to amplify the problem. And I do worry a great deal about that kind of a spark, whether in the South China Sea or in the waters around Taiwan. And I also worry that, you know, that China might put pressure on Taiwan, not so much with an all-out invasion, but by cutting undersea cables that carry internet to Taiwan, with a cyber attack, with some kind of effort to intercept shipping, maybe oil tankers to Taiwan, and then that escalates and creates a
blockade.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it would be an all-out blockade, but it might be something to the effect that, okay, you know, you all acknowledge that Taiwan is a part of China, therefore we're going to enforce Chinese laws and inspect Chinese shipping, inspect international shipping to Taiwan, and, you know, start with oil tankers as a way of putting pressure on Taiwan. I mean, that, you know, then one can imagine the U.S. escorting some oil tankers. One can imagine some kind of incident that escalates, and I think that's a, you know, that's a big concern. I guess, Pat, I would say, though, that, you know, I think we're all very focused on the competition with China, and, you know, there is good reason for that, and there are risks. But I also think that fundamentally, the outcome of this competition between the U.S. and China is going to be determined less by how many aircraft carriers we have and by what alliances we have in the region with the Philippines or other countries, although those are important, but more by our high school graduation rate, by our college attendance, by our child poverty rate, by the degree to which we can get young Americans to learn how to read, to do math and science. And that is the weak element of our competition. And that is where China has shown great strength over the last 20 years.
We also see, you know, the aggressive, I don't know if encirclement is the right word, but it's metaphorical for Hong Kong as well, abrogating some of the terms of the handover agreement from, you know, 25 years ago. Jimmy Lai, the media tycoon, being, in a sense, broken, I mean, taken down by China for exercising the kind of free speech that we in the United States think of as vital to the operation of, especially in Hong Kong, much less the rest of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I know what you mean when you say Jimmy Lai is broken, but in any real sense, he's not broken. He's imprisoned, but Jimmy will never be truly broken. I mean, he's got this incredible spirit, and the Chinese can imprison him. I don't think they can break him. I think that the aspect of Hong Kong that concerns me the most is that traditionally, China had wanted to nurture Hong Kong as an example to woo Taiwan down the road and to show that you can have one country and two systems. And China has given up on that, which suggests to me that they've given up on trying to woo Taiwan and to charm Taiwan. And, you know, if they're going to recover Taiwan, that means that it would be a more forceful approach. I don't think that they would risk that in the next 5 years. Could they risk it down the road? Yeah, they might. So I mean, what has happened to Hong Kong is just a catastrophe. I lived in Hong Kong many years ago. I was the Hong Kong bureau chief at the Times. It's an amazing place that China has really managed to gut.
It's surprising they would kill the golden goose.
Years ago, Chris Patten, the last British governor of Hong Kong, we were talking about that phrase, and I asked him, that question about, would China really kill the goose that lays the golden eggs? And he said, the only reason we have that expression is that history is littered with the carcasses of geese that laid golden eggs. And he has a point. I mean, it was not the kind of quotation that endeared him to the Chinese authorities, but he was absolutely right.
And now we have an unknown factor going on. Elon Musk has gone to China to do what?
Oh boy, I mean, a Musk expert is also an oxymoron. But I don't know. I mean, obviously, China is important in all kinds of dimensions, including vis-a-vis Tesla and what they've done with electric vehicles and with batteries is quite extraordinary. They're genuinely very impressive in that category. But I don't know. I do wish that Elon Musk would work a little harder on making Twitter workable again.
Instead of taking off to other parts.
Yeah, and I certainly don't trust his diplomacy. I mean, after his effort to solve the Ukraine crisis by basically giving much of Ukraine to Russia, I would not want to see him exercise his diplomatic skills to solve the Taiwan crisis.
Well, you bring up Russia, and Russia, China, the United States in this perpetual three-way waltz, and to see who's leading in that three-way waltz. It does seem in a way that the wheels are coming off on the home front for Putin in several ways. They've expanded numbers of morgues to accommodate all the dead coming back from the front. We saw the drone attack on Moscow, and now the Russian mercenary boss, Prigozhin, has warned that unless the elites are involved and stop sending their kids out and keeping their kids out of the conflict, that we could be in a 1917 revolution all over again. Is it really that dire?
I think that it probably is for Russia, and I don't know that it's going to be reversible. I mean, Russia also faces a real demographic crisis that has been pre-existing, but it was amplified by the Ukraine crisis and sending 600,000 men fleeing the country. And the long run economic prospects of Russia are really pretty dismal. So I think that Putin has really managed to destroy his country for years at least, and maybe decades in the future. The only reason maybe there's a little bit of a tinge of uncertainty in my voice is that I think that Putin has a plan, which I hope is unworkable, but might have a little kernel of possibility to it. And that would be that the Ukrainian counteroffensive this year does not go terribly well, that they don't gain a lot of ground, that there's a stalemate that continues throughout this year and on into next year, and that Europeans and the United States get frustrated by the lack of progress, that Europeans face a cold winter without enough natural gas, and that there is growing pressure from Europe and from the US. Maybe Republicans are doing well in next year's presidential race, and that as a result, Ukraine feels obliged to end the war on Russian terms. I think that's quite unlikely. My own best bet is that Ukraine will do pretty well on the counteroffensive, but who knows? And I think that's Putin's bet. I think it's not impossible that he will be right and will get an outcome in the war that would be, unfortunately, much better than he deserves.
So we would have for Ukraine then a kind of version of empathy fatigue?
Yeah, I mean, it would be, that unwillingness to send more missiles, more hardware, and that as a result, Ukraine isn't really in a position to continue. They don't get the economic support, even if they get the missiles, and that it would be forced to negotiate a deal that would be unfair for it. I don't think that will happen. I think it's unlikely, but not impossible.
It would be a shame then, I guess, because it sounds like the war could be won or lost by the West, not by the combatants.
Oh, Pat, I so agree with you. I mean, when I was in Ukraine, I was just so moved by the courage of folks there. And in particular, there was a young woman I met on the front. Her boyfriend had signed up for the war on the first day. He had proposed to her by FaceTime from the front, offering her the ring from a grenade as sort of a joking ring. And so they had been engaged. They were talking about how many kids they were going to have. And then he was killed. And then she signed up herself and was on the front. And I asked her, what are you doing here? And she said, they killed the man I love. Where else can I be?
Oh,
Boy, I mean, that just, the resolve, the determination, that really moved me. And that's what the Russians don't have. Can nuclear weapons compensate for a lack of resolve? Boy, I sure hope not. And I do think that, I don't know what you think, but it does seem to me as if we've been psyched out a little bit in this country. I think we should have been more willing to provide long-range missiles, ATACMS, things like this, to provide tanks and F-16s earlier, so that they could have been used in the counteroffensive. So I think that we have gotten to where we need to go, but a little too reluctantly and a little too slowly. And I think it's because of a understandable concern that Putin will escalate. But there are real dangers with letting him win as well.
We want to side with the good guys, and at least except among sub-Republican circles, Ukraine is certainly the good guys here, fighting for their independence and for democracy. But maybe because it's Henry Kissinger's 100th birthday, believe it or not, I'm inclined to ask whether in realpolitik, would the United States cynically consider more important the stability of Russia after this war, or a free and independent and democratic Ukraine, which would be in our interests?
Well, both are in our interest, but I don't think that it's in our interest to have a Russia that has achieved some stability because it has been successful in a conquest abroad. I think that it's important that the lesson be absorbed by other countries around the world, China included, that if they attempt to invade a neighbor, that they will pay a huge price and that they will lose. And I think that, will, if that message is achieved, that will make China less likely to try adventures vis-a-vis Taiwan. It would make other countries less likely to do that. So I do think it's really in our interest to support Ukraine. I think there's this misperception that somehow we're helping, Ukraine. Ukrainians are dying to support a world order that is in our interest, and they are destroying a Russian military that we have spent vast sums to confront. And so, they are doing our work for us and dying for it. And I wish we were clearer in this country about the debt we owe them.
I want to remind you that you can ask your questions of Nick Kristof. There's the Q&A box, and we will get to them as we can, certainly later in the program, and try to weave them in as the subjects appear. And right now we have a question from Robert, whether the Russian people, you think, are aware of the body bags that are being returned from Ukraine. Is the severity of this being brought home to Russians?
So my sense, and again, look, I haven't been able to report from Russia. I think after the arrest of Wall Street Journal reporter there. I think, journalists are very reluctant to report from Russia. But my sense is that there is generally more support for Putin and the invasion of Ukraine than we might expect. And that, I was struck that Ukrainians I interviewed spoke about how they had phone calls with relatives on the Russian side of the border, and that those Russians were actually, genuinely supporting the invasion. But I also think that while there is, a measure of support, that it's not deep, that a lot of it is just kind of instinctive, intuitive, a little rally around the flag, believing the national propaganda. And I think that it is vulnerable to more people dying, to economic pressure. And I think it's, one reason it's so important to make sure that the sanctions are not only on paper, but actually do bite in Russia.
We know from our history, not just recent, but very long past, that we often let technology get out from under and get away from our ability to govern it or restrain it. And Mark wants to know about concerns about China's AI capabilities, but we should broaden that out. All we hear is a lot of happy talk from tech execs, and then a few warnings, a few admonitions that, well, maybe this isn't the greatest idea after all. What are your concerns, especially apropos of China and how AI is a tool to destabilize?
So it's interesting because, if you had asked me, 5 or 10 years ago, or even a couple of years ago, I would have said that China has a substantial lead in AI, and they were doing, really amazing things with AI, and their papers were being cited in AI more than American papers were being cited. The fact that they don't have to worry about population privacy means they can do extraordinary work on facial recognition, on gait recognition of people walking and who is that, and so they seem to have a really important lead, but they can't allow AI to do anything creative. They can't allow AI to summon pictures of the June 4th massacre, for example, or to answer people's questions in any way that isn't very constrained. And so they seem to have been left behind in some really important areas of AI that, that will matter to the future and will matter economically. So I find it a little hard to figure out where that balance is. And the US papers on AI, while they're fewer, they seem to be rather more important. Is it a risk? I guess I think of any technology and platform and medium as presenting both enormous opportunities and enormous risks, and that was true of the printing press and movable type, and of radio, of TV, that they can all be used by charlatans and demagogues, but also can, powerfully support us. And so we have to figure out ways of harnessing them and making sure they don't harness us. I guess I think that there also isn't much alternative. There's been some talk in the tech community about maybe we should have a pause in development of. Well,
yeah, that's likely to happen.
Yeah, exactly. Really, that just, it just seems completely unrealistic. And even if there were an announced pause, everybody would be working on, it in there, privately, unofficially, and the bad actors would be going ahead with it. So I don't think that a pause is going to happen. I think the only real choice we have is to try to figure out intelligent ways of regulating it and harnessing it, and making sure that those involved in the regulation aren't just the AI and tech specialists, but, also, if you will, humanists who are thinking in a broad way about the role of humanity and what empowers us versus what constrains us.
I guess a lot of people think of China as so cutting edge in terms of technology that maybe there are more abilities ascribed to it than it actually has. And I'm wondering if that is a result of China's restraint on a lot of free expression, because just the crackdown on this Chinese comedian and Xi Jinping cracking down on comedy and culture, sissy men banned from television, jokes must be moderate. They detained a woman who defended this comedian's routine, defended it online. So the cultural landscape doesn't seem to allow, encourage, and in fact punishes the kind of free expression that may help the development of things like AI.
Yeah, you know, Pat, I think that's astute. And I think that Xi Jinping is making a different trade-off than Deng Xiaoping did, for example. And when China opened up in 1978, Deng Xiaoping faced a choice. And to what extent do you allow people to leave? To what extent do you allow foreigners to come in? Later, to what extent do you allow fax machines, photocopiers, later email, things that the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc had in general restricted, because, you allow photocopiers and then who knows what they'll copy. And
besides, everybody photocopied their butts and then they moved on to something.
But Deng Xiaoping's line was that, you have to open the windows and that, yes, some flies will come in, but it's still important to have that fresh air. And I think that Xi Jinping, his calculation is different. And he doesn't want those flies in. He doesn't want those jokes, et cetera. And so he wants to keep the windows closed, and that has already affected the market economy and the private companies. I think it's affected the culture scene. I think it's affected international interactions, and I think it can't help but affect scientific development. Fewer scientific exchanges, that kind of thing. So I think that's a bad trade-off from his point of view.
You and your wife have written so movingly about the state and fate of women around the world. And of course, now some of this AI is being used to generate pornography, including kiddie pornography. But looking at the status of women worldwide, it seems like there were advances, and now it seems like there's so much pushback right here in the United States. Women's control over their own lives, their reproductive lives, is being so constrained. We used to look at the rest of the world and say, you guys, you shouldn't really do that, because look at what we're able to do here in the United States. And now that seems to be regressing too.
So I think you're right that there has been a backlash and a certain amount of regression, and that has been true in the US. It's also been true in places like South Korea. And Roe v. Wade is one obvious example of that. But I would be cautious about over-interpreting that. I tend to think that education is the most important force for empowering people, for determining what the future will look like 20 or 40 years from now. And in education, the advances that women made have not been eroded at all. And in fact, if you think about the ratio among college undergraduates in America, sex ratio among college undergraduates when Title IX was passed, it is now more than the reverse. The gap between, at that point, obviously more males than females. Now it's more females than males by an even larger margin. And likewise, more women than men in law school, more women than men in med school. I think and hope that the success of women in those professional fields, including more in politics, obviously, in journalism. You've seen as well, and you represent just the way our own discipline of journalism has been transformed by increasing presence of women in our careers. I think that is not going to be undone. So I think these are setbacks that that we will overcome down the road.
You mentioned education. Just before you joined us, you hit send on a column you've just written about education in Mississippi, and And for decades, whatever state of despair schools have been in other states, have always said, well, at least we're better than Mississippi. So you found something in Mississippi that is the ray of hope at the bottom of the Pandora's box. What is it? Mississippi doing something right. Let's make some headlines here.
Who'd have thought it? So the backdrop of it is, again, I have this very profound belief that the best escalator, out of poverty, whether you're talking about the US or Zimbabwe, is education. But that for those who most need it, whether in Zimbabwe or the US, it tends to be broken. And I've written a lot about my old classmates here in rural Oregon who died of drugs, alcohol, suicide. What would have made a difference in their lives? I do think it's education more than anything else. And I think we as a country have really failed so many kids around the country by failing to get them to read, to do math, to get them through high school, to get them some kind of either college or some kind of a vocational training. And so I'm doing a series for the Times about, how do we fix America's problems? And so I was looking at education, and, astonishingly, Mississippi has done amazing things over the last dozen years or so. They went from the bottom of the country to about the middle. And if you adjust for demographics, then they're near the top. For kids living in poverty, I think they rank number 1 in reading and 2nd in math. That's approximately right.
How did that happen?
So, there wasn't any, people talk about the Mississippi miracle. There wasn't really a miracle. It was a lot of hard work. It was meticulous following of the evidence. It was a lot of metrics, evaluation, monitoring. It was a focus on what's called the science of reading, which is a very evidence-based approach to getting all kids to read. It was really an obsessive effort to make sure that all kids can read by the end of 3rd grade, with a lot of tutoring for those who were left behind, constant assessments, incredible effort to get every kid to graduate from high school. I was in the Mississippi Delta, one of the poorest parts of the country. And I was talking to a school superintendent, and he said, I asked what his high school graduation rate was, and he said 97%. I just, I didn't believe it. And I checked it out, and indeed it was true. And we talked about it, and he gave an example of a girl in his high school who had just dropped out. She had a single mom. The family was living in poverty. They just didn't have any income. She had to quit to get a job to work. And then the school just went all out to recover this girl. The teacher, the principal, the kind of a social worker at the school, they visited the girl repeatedly at her home. They visited the employer that she had just gone to work for. They used other intermediaries in the community who knew the family. And they got the employer to work out a deal so that he would hire the girl after school hours. And she is now back in school, on track to graduate.
Can you scale that up?
So one of the things I was wondering is, can you replicate that around the country? Some of these things I think you can. I think we can work much, much harder on getting kids to graduate. I think that there's been a really fruitful conversation in this country about how we get more kids into college. I don't think we've tried as hard to get every kid graduating from high school. And if you don't graduate from high school in 2023, you are cooked. Your kids are probably cooked. We've got to do a better job in that regard. And I guess one thing that struck me about Mississippi is there have been so many just toxic debates about K through 12 education, and the education reform movement has kind of fizzled. But Mississippi managed to do this, without spending a ton more money, without antagonizing teachers. The teachers union in Mississippi is weak, but it supported these efforts. And Mississippi didn't solve child poverty. It didn't solve racism. It didn't solve dysfunctional housing for kids, but it did manage to get all kids to read. And what it means is that it takes away from all the rest of us an excuse that, well, this is poverty, we can't help these kids. We have no excuse now. If Mississippi can do it, all states can do it.
And yet we've seen pushback in a lot of those same states like Mississippi of taking books off the shelves, taking books away from kids. Can't remember which state it was, but a mother who said that she'd never really read the Amanda Gorman poem wanted to ban the Amanda Gorman poem in the book that it appeared in. So many books that have been obviously banned and discussed for years, but new books too, books that have helped kids deal with their sexuality when they weren't getting any support at home. At the same time, we're seeing a Mississippi miracle. We're telling kids, no, you can't read that. We're approaching the 100th anniversary of the Scopes trial, where Tennessee banned the teaching of evolution and prosecuted a teacher for doing it. That sounds like a 100-year cycle is back again.
Yeah. And one of the things that I worry about, I mean, the southern states in particular have historically hugely underinvested in human capital. I mean, partly because they thought that if they invested in human capital, African Americans would benefit. And I think that was one reason why they, underinvested in health and education and so on. Now they have been noting Mississippi's success and to some degree have been following it, in particular Alabama. But one thing that I worry about is that they are now all going to be sidetracked by these culture wars and, by their quest to, ban drag performances or to, pull Amanda Gorman's book out of the school library. That would be a catastrophe. But we also, I think it's very easy for people in California or Oregon or any other state to focus on the book burning. And, that's appalling and we obviously need to oppose it. But we also have to make sure that we accept no excuse for our own kids and our own states not learning to read, not learning to do math. And, that's a harder conversation. And California schools and Oregon schools have been struggling with outcomes. There's a profound inequity. We've got to address those problems as well.
You mentioned the war on drag queens. It seems we've got a war on and China is going after comedians and this cultural purge. I don't know if that's the word I want to invoke again under the circumstances, but it's like, all right, we need this enemy to focus on, but it's so much more serious abroad. Where is it in Uganda, where you can be executed, these new laws against gays, and we're not setting the example that we used to for the rest of the world. We can't tell other people you shouldn't be doing this when we see this happening in our own backyards. Yeah,
that's right. I really do believe that our soft power and the example that we show is the way we have the greatest influence. I must say, I was just in Sierra Leone, and the Sierra Leone bans homosexual contact. It's illegal, as it is in, I believe, 38 countries in Africa, not to the extent of Uganda, where in some circumstances it can be punishable by death, according to the new law, but it's still illegal. And yet I was struck by these high school girls in northern Sierra Leone, is a town called Makeni in the middle of nowhere, who were watching TikTok videos of American lesbians and kind of learning about the world and possibilities that they, might never have imagined. And that's an example of our soft power if the United States is held in high repute. If people look to us for models of social and political behavior to emulate, that's easier when we're not having ridiculous debt ceiling fights and these, book banning efforts, and where we set an example that people look up to.
Who do we have? There's a question about Africa from Norman about the famine in Somalia and what the UN is doing. What are individuals, NGOs doing, and the United States doing? And we see recurrent famines, and of course, climate change is only making it worse.
Yeah, absolutely. I was in Somalia in January, and there's a desperate food crisis, and even in a normal year, there are large numbers of children who will die of malnutrition in Somalia, and that's true worldwide. I think 23% of all child deaths worldwide are linked in some form to malnutrition. In Somalia, I would actually say that the US and UN have done a pretty decent job so far in trying to address the crisis. But there is still a quite significant risk that the situation will go downhill. It depends a great deal on whether the rains fall there, and as you suggest, they've been disrupted by climate change. And Pat, this will resonate. Just in journalism, we try to think how we get people engaged in these issues. And one of the things that I worry about is that the American public is retreating from engagement in some of these international issues. And so, I went out to Somalia. It was expensive for the New York Times. It involved a certain amount of risk. And my column was read basically by my mom and my wife, and that was pretty much it. And
your editor, I hope.
Yeah, and my editor. But the reason that CNN or MSNBC or Fox News are not covering Somalia and elevating it is because there isn't really a business model for covering these kinds of international crises. And historically, news organizations tended to cover them and get them more attention because there was this sort of sense of, responsibility. This is what we do. And now everybody is so focused on their audience, and we have much better metrics to determine what our audience is interested in, that means we tend not to cover these kinds of global crises to the degree that I think helps lead to solutions. And so
that's an ongoing discussion in journalism, how the marketing has played a much bigger role than in the days when the audience was in a sense opaque, that we covered stories based on what we thought were important stories rather than what we thought the audience thought were important stories.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I don't know about you. I always had I always knew back in the days of paper that, that my columns or my articles about something political in the US would be much more read than articles abroad. But now that we know the number of page views, it is just staggering, the difference. I once had back-to-back columns from Yemen and about the Brett Kavanaugh nomination when he was up. And, it wasn't that my Kavanaugh column, which, the Kavanaugh column I could do in an afternoon, while, Yemen, again, involved an expense, a certain amount of danger. It wasn't that the Kavanaugh column had 50% more readers or twice as many. It had 8 times as many. And it's, I'm at a stage in my career where I can go and report on things that only my mother and wife will read. And, I sort of carry the flag. But it's you see why news organizations don't do more coverage of these kinds of issues. And when we don't cover them, they don't get addressed.
And therefore, the United States as a policymaker tends to retreat from engaging on them at many official levels too.
That's exactly right. So we have to figure out, I think we in journalism have to do a better job. I think that bleeding hearts in nonprofits and advocacy groups all need to figure out how to do a better job engaging people. And I think that it also, I think that one of the problems is that when we cover the world, or when nonprofits, jump up and down about a crisis like Somalia, that we focus so much on all that is going wrong that we leave the public with this sense of exhaustion and just a sense that nothing can ever go right, that, poor Somalia, it's too bad, but, Somalia can never be rescued. And in fact, I think that's somewhat misleading, and that we have managed to make real progress on a lot of international crises, and that the relentless focus on things that are going wrong leaves the public often unaware of a backdrop of progress that would be energizing. And, trying to figure out that balance as we cover these crises, or as nonprofits call attention to problems, is really difficult to navigate. But I think if we accentuated the positive a little more, we might get more it might be easier to rally people to address these problems.
For folks who might have a question for Nick Kristof, you can put it in the Q&A box. We'll try to get to it in this portion of the program. We have a question from, let's see, where did it go? Robert says, Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders of Arkansas signed a bill this month rolling back the state's child labor protections, making it easier for employers to hire children under 16. We've talked about a labor shortage in this country, but I don't think I ever thought this was the way that people thought they would solve it. And this seems to be catching on.
So the I mean, I don't have any objection in some circumstances to kids working in ways that aren't going to undermine their education. I'm in this rural farm area. I worked in the summer picking strawberries, picking beans, haying, and so on. I think that the real problem comes when when this interferes with school, and it often does. But I think that the larger problem, rather than allowing some kids to work, is the Republican obsession with work requirements for Medicaid, for food stamps, et cetera. And this Republican obsession, I think, comes from there's a genuine argument that it is good for people of working age in general to work. And I think that we, as Democrats, often didn't fully appreciate the self-esteem, the sense of identity that comes from a job. During recessions, we tended to think that a stream of payments could substitute for a job, and it can't. And there's abundant evidence for that. But while there are plenty of reasons to encourage labor force participation, with job training programs, with various subsidies, earned income tax credit, for example, the idea of work requirements is a catastrophe that is fundamentally, it doesn't work, and it's cruel and cuts people off from benefits they are entitled to. Arkansas was the state that pioneered work requirements for Medicaid, and this had no impact in getting more people in the labor force, but it created one more barrier for a lot of people who are often moving from home to home from getting health care. And when people on the edge don't get health care, then too often, they die or they can't get a job. So this obsession with work requirements for benefit programs is just so wrong-headed and just so frustrating. It's just really awful policy.
At the same time, we've seen new muscularity in labor unions, in workers' movements, in higher pay demands and that sort of thing. We also see a pushback to the old idea of the deserving poor, and the conclusion in a lot of quarters is that the poor deserve nothing. Where is this conflict taking us in this country?
Yeah, I mean, we're being tugged in both directions. So I think that the gains in labor unions are really important, and that private sector labor unions, I think that the kind of my demographic of well-educated Americans working in white-collar jobs came to be somewhat scornful of private sector labor unions and saw them as dens of corruption, as engines that tended to discriminate against people of color, for example, or against women. And, there was a measure of truth to all that. But as private sector labor unions essentially collapsed, and I think now account for only 6% of the labor force, the result was a huge gain in a huge rise in inequality. And by some measures, 20 to 30% of the increase in inequality is because of the decline in private sector labor unions. Those private sector labor unions, they don't just benefit those people who are working for that in that union, they benefit people in that sector. And so I think that has been a really encouraging factor. When I had my 10-minute political career running for governor in Oregon, the campaign staff formed a union. I think it was the first union in a statewide campaign here. And, I thought that was great. I hope private sector unions do continue. But I mean, the undeserving poor point you make is absolutely true. I think we have, conversely, this sort of obsession with this personal responsibility narrative, that it's all about, picking yourself up by the bootstraps. And that expression, picking yourself up by the bootstraps, it originally meant the opposite of what it does now. In the 1800s, it was used as a satirical, comic phrase to refer to something impossible. And then somehow, in the last 50 years, it became this instruction, this didactic advice for what people should do. And it's, that I think the personal responsibility narrative, I don't know, let me put it this way. Personal responsibility is real, and there's no doubt that people get in trouble when they make bad choices. But if we're going to have that discussion about personal responsibility, we also have to have a discussion about our collective social responsibility to get kids educated, to shield them from trauma, to give them skills so they can compete in the labor market, to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
So let's see if I can find the name on this question. Someone was quite taken with the quilt behind you and wanted to know the story of this quilt as you are sitting in your farmhouse there in Yam Hill.
So that quilt is one I got in India, and I got it in Kolkata years ago. But no particular story about it. I don't know how well you can see the Chinese painting there on the wall. I got it in China when my wife and I when we were correspondents for the Times. We were tailed every time we left our compound. It was just we were being summoned to be yelled at by the foreign ministry. I was periodically summoned at and yelled at for my wife's articles. And so this pair of lovebirds on a snowy branch in the winter, shivering together, it seemed to kind of capture the way it's almost felt for us in Beijing.
I love that story. We have a few minutes. Alan would like you to size up the presidential race and what it looks like for Biden versus any Republican nominee right now.
Well, any political advice from me or analysis should be, filtered through the knowledge that, I couldn't even manage to get on the ballot in Oregon.
It was a residency requirement. We'll tell people you did not lose. So, you never lost an election.
I never lost an election. And, in 2016, I never expected Trump would be the nominee. But this round, I think he's, it sure looks like he will be the nominee, even as he goes through, another civil trial this fall, and then probably a series of criminal prosecutions. The federal prosecution, I think, is the one he should probably most worry about, plus the one in Georgia. But I think that the prosecutions, if anything, may strengthen Trump within the Republican field. And he would seem to be so weak a candidate at that point that could Biden actually lose to him? Who knows? I mean, if there's a recession in this country, as there might be, then people may well be mad at the sitting president. If something were to happen to Biden and Kamala Harris were the nominee, I think she would be significantly weaker than Biden in ways that might help Trump actually win a general election. And, we just saw the election of Erdogan, re-election of Erdogan in Turkey. He was a guy who had been incompetent, had presided over repression, had presided over real economic troubles. I think there was widespread expectation he was never going to win, and he won by pushing these kind of culture war issues. So I just worry that Democrats are a little bit too confident that they can inevitably beat Trump. I think Trump may well be the Republican nominee, and would be such a catastrophe if he were elected that, boy, I think that'd be unlikely, but impossible? No, it's possible.
In 2016, Hillary Clinton's campaign wanted Trump to be the nominee because they figured he was the easiest candidate to beat. And look what happened, even though she won the popular vote by what, 3 million,
votes.
the electoral vote went that way. We want to end on an upbeat note. And we had a question, I think, from, let me see if I can find the name. I think it was Job, about whether you'd finished hiking the Pacific Trail, and you'd written something about hiking as a parenting tool. So I want to give you a moment to talk about that.
Yeah. So yes, I have. So my daughter and I hiked the whole Pacific Crest Trail, Mexico to Canada. We did it in stages over 6 years, and best parenting I ever did. It got us both away from our screens. We both, got mosquito bit. We got, we had sleepless nights on rocks. It was great parenting. It's great to suffer together with your daughter or whoever it may be. So I recommend it. And just the glory of kind of wandering through nature's cathedral for 2,650 miles is an amazing experience. And I guess just more broadly, to end on an optimistic note, I just finished my memoir, and so it's been a chance to kind of think through lessons learned over a long period reporting. And I think one is this thing that we've evolved to be very alert to all kinds of things going wrong. And that's a good protective mechanism, but it's also important to acknowledge all the things that are going right. And I think that when historians look back on our age, they will believe that the most important thing is that we presided over this incredible unleashing of human opportunity around the world. When I graduated from college, 41% of the world's people lived in extreme poverty. Now about 8% do. When I was a kid—
Wait, can you repeat those numbers?
Yeah, so when I graduated from college, 41% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty. That's about $2.15 a day per person. Now that's down to 8%. Just a plunge in extreme poverty. Maybe the worst thing that can happen to anybody is to lose a child. And historically, almost half of children died before adulthood. Now we're down to 4% of children dying. Still far too many, but that's an extraordinary decline. Number of women dying of childbirth. Over and over.
Nick Kristof, we'll have to leave it at that, but that number alone gives me immense hope. And so thank you for providing that. It's what we always try to do at the end of all of these sessions. We hope you will join us again next week. And with the problems of the world being solved in an hour with your questions, we appreciate it so much. Nick Kristof, thanks again. Thanks to all of you.
Great to be with you.
And thanks to you who support this excellent program as we see June 7th, Neil Katyal with Warren Olney about law, democracy, and our future. Thank you so much.